The document arrived on a Tuesday, stuffed inside a cracked leather satchel carried by a sweating courier boy who didn't even wait for Reuben Whitaker to fully open his door before turning and running back down the dirt road like something had bitten him. Reuben stood on the warped wooden planks of his porch and stared at the paper. It was stamped 3 times with the red wax seal of Alderman Crewe, the man who ran the Crosshaven trading post like a personal fiefdom, and the language was the precise, bloodless kind that men like Crewe paid other men to write when they didn't want to say ugly things with their own mouth. It said in summary that Reuben Whitaker's lease on the trapper's cabin at the eastern edge of the Crosshaven post grounds had been defaulted. It said that a breach of the Regional Trapping Guild Compact meant his operating rights had lapsed. It said that an enforcer would arrive within 3 days to facilitate his removal, and that any resistance would be considered a violation of the Crosshaven Settlement Charter, which would make things considerably worse for him. Reuben read it twice. Then he folded it into thirds, tucked it in his shirt pocket, sat down in the pine chair on his porch and looked out at the mountains. The mountains were beautiful. They always were. The High Plains light was long and gold, and it caught the snowcaps and turned them the color of honey, and the spruce forests below the snowline were so dark they were nearly black, and the wagon road that ran through the flat country below was just a pale scar cutting across all that wildness. He had trapped those mountains for 6 years. He had walked every ridge line, set lines along every creek, know where the beaver dams thickened in autumn and where the fox dens opened in spring. He had a good cabin, a good stove, a good horse, and a good life, even if it was a mostly solitary one. He wasn't going anywhere. He didn't know what compact they were claiming he had breached. His guild dues were paid. His territory markers were maintained. The only thing he could think of was the new boundary survey Crewe had commissioned 2 months back, the one that had conveniently redrawn the post grounds to include about 40 acres of what Reuben had always considered open range. He had said as much, loudly, in the post tavern in front of witnesses, which was probably why Crewe had jumped to the enforcer option rather than trying to settle it quietly. 3 days. He had 3 days before an enforcer showed up. He went inside, ate a cold supper of dried venison and flatbread, and slept without dreaming. The enforcer arrived early on the 2nd day. Reuben was on his porch again, sharpening a skinning knife with a whetstone, watching the wagon road when he saw her coming. She was on foot, which surprised him, walking up the long rise from the post with a measured, unhurried stride that ate up the distance without apparent effort. She was carrying a leather satchel of her own and a short iron-shod staff, and as she got closer Reuben's hand slowed on the whetstone and then stopped entirely. She was an orc woman. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the smooth green-gray skin of the high country clans and dark tusks that curved just slightly upward from her lower jaw. Her hair was thick and black, pulled back from her face with a cord so that it fell down her back in a heavy braid. She was wearing fitted travel leathers that showed she meant business and knew her own body. A dark brown leather bodice that laced up the front and shaped itself to a strong torso, paired with close-cut riding trousers tucked into knee-high boots, and a short oilskin riding jacket pushed back at the shoulders. She was striking in a way that was impossible to be casual about, all clean lines and coiled power, and she walked like someone who had been trained to assume that whatever room she entered already belonged to her. She came up the rise, came through the gate in his low picket fence, came up the path and stopped at the foot of his porch steps. She looked up at him with amber eyes that were calm and assessing and completely unamused. "Reuben Whitaker," she said. It was not a question. "That's me," he said. "I am Snaga Ironhide. I have been engaged by Alderman Crewe as a settlement enforcer under the Crosshaven Charter. I am here to notify you that your occupation of this cabin is in default and that you are required to vacate within 48 hours. She reached into her satchel and produced a second document which she held out to him. He didn't take it. "I read the first one," he said. "This is the formal notice of enforcement, which is a different document." I figured as much. He set the knife and stone aside. You want to come up here and tell me which compact I supposedly breached, because I've got my guild record going back 6 years and I can't find it. She studied him for a moment. That is not my area of authority. I enforce the order. I don't adjudicate the underlying dispute. Then I've got nothing to say to you, Reuben said, not unkindly. I'm not leaving. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked up the 2 porch steps, turned, and sat down on the top step with her back to him and her face toward the mountains, settling herself with the calm deliberateness of someone who had decided something and was done deciding. Reuben stared at the back of her head. "What are you doing?" he said. "Waiting," she said. "For what? For you to come to your senses or for the 48 hours to expire, whichever comes first." He almost laughed. He stopped himself. "You're going to sit on my porch for 48 hours. If necessary, that's going to get uncomfortable." "I am comfortable," she said, in a tone that suggested she had been comfortable in considerably worse places and did not expect that to change. Reuben looked at the back of her braid, the straight line of her shoulders, the way she held the staff across her knees. She wasn't bluffing. She was absolutely, completely, infuriatingly prepared to sit on his porch steps for 2 full days. He picked up his whetstone and his knife and started sharpening again, because there was nothing else to do. The afternoon stretched out around them. The wind came down from the mountains smelling of pine resin and cold stone. A hawk turned in a slow circle over the lower fields. The sounds of the post drifted up from the road: wagon wheels, a smith's hammer, someone calling across the yard. Neither of them spoke for a long time. It was Reuben who broke first. "You want water?" he said. She didn't turn around. "Yes." He went inside and came back with 2 tin cups and a jug and poured hers and handed it around in front of her. She took it without ceremony and drank half of it in one long pull, which told him she'd walked a good distance before he'd seen her on the road. He sat back in his chair and drank his own. "Ironhide," he said. "That's a clan name." "The Ironhide clan, yes. Upper Sareth Range originally. Long way from the Sareth Range." "Yes," she said. There was no self-pity in it, just fact. "How long have you been working enforcement?" She was quiet for a moment, as if calculating whether to answer. 3 years, she said. "Before that I was a boundary guard for the Merchants' Council in Velstone. And before that," another pause, "clan business." He knew better than to push on that. The Ironhide clan had been one of the holdouts in the old war, the ones who had kept fighting after the treaties were signed because no one had bothered to tell them the terms or because they hadn't agreed with the terms, depending on who told the story. That was 16 years ago. He had been 12 years old when it ended. "Must be strange," he said. "Working for aldermen." "All work is strange if you think about it too much," she said. He had no good answer for that. He sat and watched the mountains go from gold to orange to deep purple, and she sat on his steps and did not move. When the light was fully gone and the stars were coming out over the high peaks, she stood, finally, and stretched, and that was the only sign she gave that 2 hours on his porch steps had been anything other than pleasant. "I will return in the morning," she said. "I know you will," he said. She walked down the path to the gate, and he watched her go until the dark took her, and he couldn't tell you exactly why he kept watching even after he couldn't see her anymore. She came back the next morning before the dew was off the grass. He saw her coming up the road again and had a pot of tea going by the time she reached the gate. He poured it into 2 tin cups, already on the railing, and she came up the steps and picked one up and stood there drinking it like they had established some kind of routine, which apparently they had. 24 hours, she said. "I'm aware," he said. "You should reconsider, Whitaker. Crewe has the authority to call in a charter warrant if you refuse the enforcement notice. That means the post constable, and that gets messy for everyone." Crewe drew that new boundary survey himself, Reuben said. He hired the surveyor, paid the surveyor, and the surveyor's measurements conveniently add about 40 acres of mountain slope to the post grounds. That slope is my trapline. He knows it. You probably know it too. She held her cup with both hands. Her amber eyes were on him, and there was something in them that wasn't quite the bland, official calm she'd been projecting the day before. I was told there was a compact breach, she said. There isn't one. Or if there is, it's manufactured. He leaned his forearms on the porch railing, which means you're not really here to enforce a lease default. You're here to evict a man who complained about a corrupt alderman. She said nothing. I'm just pointing that out, he said, in case it affects your professional comfort. My professional comfort, she said very precisely, is not your concern. No, he admitted. I suppose it isn't. But she stayed standing that time, drinking her tea at the railing instead of sitting on the steps, and he thought that probably meant something. They didn't talk much that morning. He had gear to maintain, and she clearly had no interest in small talk. But around mid-morning, he heard a commotion down on the road, raised voices, and the hard sound of boots on packed dirt, and both of them looked down toward the post at the same time. There were 3 men coming up the road at a pace that said trouble. Reuben recognized the one in the middle, Garv Austin, who ran Crewe's timber operation and liked to settle things physically when he thought he could get away with it. The 2 with him were hired muscle, the kind you found in any trading post if you knew where to look. That be Crewe losing patience, Reuben said. Snaga put her teacup down on the railing. She squared herself toward the road, and something in her posture shifted, subtle but very definite, the way a blade shifts when someone takes a proper grip. Austin came through the gate without stopping. He pointed at Reuben. Whitaker, I've come to make this official. You're out. I've got 24 hours on my enforcement notice, Reuben said, and I intend to use them to file a complaint with the charter office in Durham. Durham is 3 days' ride, Austin said, with the satisfied smile of a man who has already thought this through. You'll be gone before anyone there can read a letter. Austin. Snaga's voice was flat and precise as an axe head. I am the active enforcer on this matter under Crewe's own charter engagement. The notice period is valid and has not expired. You are interfering with a lawful enforcement process. Austin looked at her. A lot of men looked at orc women that way, with the quick assessment of whether they actually had to take her seriously. Austin's assessment was clearly coming down on the wrong side. I don't think you understand how this works here, he said. We do things Crewe's way. Then Crewe should not have hired a charter enforcer, she said, because charter enforcers do things the charter's way. She did not move from the porch. She didn't need to. She was a head taller than Austin, and her hand was on the iron-shod staff, and the absolute steadiness of her made the 3 men's blustery forward momentum simply stop working. Reuben watched Austin do the math. He watched Austin look at Snaga, then at his 2 men, then back at Snaga, and decide that if this went physical he was going to come out the worse for it, and that he would need to report that back to Crewe, and that maybe this was a complication Crewe hadn't fully accounted for. 24 hours, Austin said. Not 1 minute more. He turned and went back through the gate, and his men followed him, and the 3 of them went back down the road the way they'd come. Snaga watched them go until they were back at the post. Then she picked up her teacup and found it had gone cold. Thank you, Reuben said. She glanced at him sideways. That was charter procedure, not personal. Sure, he said. He poured her fresh tea. She accepted it. That afternoon things shifted. Not dramatically, there was no single moment he could point to later, but the quality of the silence between them changed. She sat on the steps again, which he had expected, but now she asked him what he was doing as he sorted through a pile of iron traps that needed resetting, and he explained the mechanism to her, and she asked a pointed question about the release spring, and he showed her. And somehow they were sitting side by side on the porch floor with trap components spread between them, and the conversation had been going for an hour without either of them noticing. She had opinions. Strong, specific, detailed opinions about everything from trapping ethics to the politics of the Merchants' Council in Velstone, to the quality of the blacksmithing at the post. She was funny in a way that she didn't seem fully aware of, dry and deadpan and occasionally devastating, and the first time she actually made him laugh she looked at him with surprise, as if the reaction was new to her. You're not what I expected, he said, when they had worked through most of the afternoon and the shadows were going long. What did you expect? She asked. He thought about it honestly. Someone who wouldn't drink my tea. She looked at him for a moment. I expected someone who would be gone by now. Disappointed. No, she said, and looked back at the mountains. That night she didn't leave. He hadn't asked her to stay. She hadn't announced that she would. It just became apparent around supper time that walking back to the post in the dark when she had to be back at first light anyway was wasteful, and Reuben was making supper anyway, and he had a blanket and a perfectly good floor. He didn't make a production of it. She didn't either. She ate his flatbread and venison stew with genuine appreciation, and told him it was better than anything she'd had at the Post Tavern, which, given the Post Tavern's reputation for boiled gray food, was not a high bar, but she said it like she meant it. He asked her about the Ironhide clan, carefully, the way you asked about things that might have sharp edges, and she told him a little. Not about the war. About the mountains, about the specific green of the high Sareth valleys in spring, about the way the clan marked territory not with fences but with carved stones, and the stories those stones told about who had been there and what they had done. Do you miss it? He said. Yes, she said simply, but you cannot always go back to what you miss. Sometimes what you miss is gone. The fire popped. The wind pressed against the window. Reuben thought about 6 years alone on this mountain line, about the way a cabin could feel large and small at the same time depending on what you brought home with you. I know something about that, he said. She looked at him across the fire, and something in her expression softened for a moment, not into weakness, but into recognition, the look of someone who has been understood unexpectedly. I know you do, she said. He gave her the floor and the blanket, and she waved off the extra pillow, and he went asleep in his own bunk, listening to her breathing even out from the other side of the cabin, and thinking that this was the strangest 2 days he had experienced in a very long time. In the morning he woke up and she was already outside, standing in the yard watching the road, and the 48 hours were up. He joined her. Time to go, Whitaker, she said. But there was something in it that wasn't quite the same as the first time she had said something like that. I told you, he said. I'm filing with the charter office. I need 2 more days to get to Durham and back. I cannot grant you an extension without Crewe's authorization. Then get Crewe's authorization. She turned and looked at him fully. You're asking me to go to Crewe and request a filing extension for the man I'm supposed to be evicting. I'm asking you to uphold the charter's own complaint process, he said, which says a leaseholder has the right to file a grievance before enforcement is completed, which is charter law, not something I invented. She was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved her braid. I looked at your guild record last night, she said. While you were sleeping, there is no compact breach. The notation on the enforcement order references a subsidiary clause that hasn't been invoked in 40 years and was specifically written for seasonal operations, which yours is not. He stared at her. Then the order is fraudulent. The order is, she chose the word carefully, questionable. Snaga. It was the first time he had used her name, and she registered it, a small thing but unmistakable. Yes, she said quietly, it is fraudulent. So help me file the complaint. She looked at the road. She looked at the mountains. She looked back at him, and he could see the calculus happening behind those amber eyes, the professional calculation and the personal one running side by side, pulling in different directions, neither one winning cleanly. I will go to Crewe, she said finally. I will tell him the complaint process requires an extension. He will not give it willingly, which means we will likely need to go to Durham ourselves to file before he moves on this by other means. We, he said. Yes, she said, and didn't look away. Unless you have an objection. None, he said, not a single one. They rode out within the hour, Reuben on his roan gelding and Snaga on a tough, short-legged gray horse she had stabled at the post. It was 15 miles to where the wagon road branched south toward Durham, and the morning was clear and cold with a wind coming off the high peaks that smelled of everything still untouched. They stopped at the post on the way through. It was Reuben's idea against Snaga's advice, but he wanted to collect his guild documents from the post office box, and while he was doing that, Snaga went to find Crewe. He heard the conversation from 40 feet away. Crewe's voice, indignant and climbing. Snaga's voice, flat, precise, and implacable. The sound of a door opening and then something hitting a wall, which was probably Crewe expressing himself, and then Snaga's voice again, even flatter than before, delivering what sounded like a very specific legal consequence in very measured terms. Reuben collected his documents and went back outside into the yard and waited. Snaga came out 2 minutes later with 2 spots of color in her gray-green cheeks that were the orc equivalent. He was learning, of a significant emotional temperature. He refused the extension, she said. I assumed. He also threatened to file a breach of engagement claim against me for non-performance of the enforcement order. That sounds unpleasant. It is manageable, she looked at him. He also said something I will not repeat. He looked at her face. The 2 spots of color were still there. About you, it does not matter. It matters to me. She met his eyes, and something passed between them that was more than professional and more than friendly and didn't have a clean name yet. Thank you, she said quietly. But I have heard worse, and I am here, and he is in there, so I think I have won that particular exchange. They mounted up and rode south. The wagon road to Durham was a wide, rutted track that ran through 20 miles of open high plains before the land started to fold down into the river valley, where the town sat. The grass on either side was autumn dry and gold brown, and there were hawk eagles riding the thermals overhead, and the whole landscape had the particular clarity of a fine day after weeks of gray. It was the kind of country that made you understand why people settled in hard places. Riding beside Snaga, Reuben thought about the past 2 days. He thought about the fact that she had sat on his porch steps for the better part of an afternoon rather than leave, and that he had, without quite deciding to, started looking forward to her coming back. Tell me about Crewe, she said, after they had been riding for a while. The whole story, not just the boundary survey. He told her. It was more than he'd told anyone, because usually he didn't talk about his business to other people. But she asked the right questions, and she listened with the focused attention of someone taking careful inventory. And by the time he was finished, he had explained the whole 6 years. How he'd come to Crosshaven after working trap lines further east, how he'd built the cabin himself on a 2-year lease that had been renewed twice without issue. How Crewe had started pressing on territory about a year ago when the northern fur demand had gone up, and the eastern trapline had become considerably more profitable. He wants the cabin as a way station for his own trapping crews, Snaga said. It's in a better position than anything he currently has. That's what I think too, Reuben said. And because you went public with the survey complaint, he can't just buy you out, because that would be admitting the survey was wrong. So instead he manufactures a compact breach and sends an enforcer to remove me on legal grounds. She nodded slowly, working through it. He hired me because I was the cheapest available enforcer who had the right charter credentials. He didn't expect me to actually read the documents. He also didn't expect you to stay on my porch. She glanced at him with something that might, in another woman, have been the beginning of a smile. No, she said. I imagine he did not. They rode in silence for a while. The road dipped through a shallow creek crossing, and their horses picked their way across the stones, and on the other side the grass was greener from the water, and there were alders along the bank with their leaves just starting to go yellow. Why did you stay? He asked. On the porch. You could have posted the notice and left. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. The first time I got an enforcement assignment, she said, I evicted a miller. The claim against him was legitimate. He had actually breached his agreement, but the situation wasn't right. He had a sick wife, and the eviction was timed for winter, and there was a child involved. She paused. I executed the order anyway, because that is what the contract required, and because I was new and I believed the contract was sufficient reason. What happened? They survived, she said. I heard about it later, but I never found out if she recovered or if they rebuilt, and I think about that sometimes. She looked at the road ahead. With you, the first time I saw you, you were sitting on your porch sharpening a knife, and you read that notice and just went back to sharpening. No bluster, no threats. Just sitting in your own place doing your own work like you were going to go on doing it regardless. She paused again. I wanted to see what would happen. And what happened, he said. The milk is still in the cup, she said, which was an orc saying he didn't know, and the way she said it made him think she wasn't going to explain it just yet, and that was fine because they had 15 more miles to Durin. They made it to Durin before sunset, and filed the grievance complaint with the charter office before the clerk went home for the evening, which required some argument from Snaga, and the deployment of what appeared to be an encyclopedic knowledge of charter procedure law that left the clerk looking slightly glassy. The complaint was accepted, time-stamped, and placed in the official record, which meant Crewe could not proceed with enforcement for a minimum of 14 days pending review. 14 days. Reuben stood outside the charter office in the golden evening light of Durin's Main Street and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 2 days. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me yet, she said. Crewe has money and connections in this district. The charter process gives us 14 days, not a verdict. I know, but we have 14 days, that's something. She was standing with the late light falling on her face and catching in her amber eyes and turning her dark braid copper, and Reuben was struck by how completely improbable this was. That the woman Crewe had sent to remove him was the same one who had just filed the legal block against Crewe on his behalf, and that standing here with her in the street felt as natural as anything he could remember in years. They found a traveler's inn, and Snaga negotiated rooms with the same calm authority she brought to everything, and they ate supper in the common room, real food, roast pork and root vegetables and bread that was fresh enough to still be warm, and a pot of dark local ale between them that got lower over the course of the evening as they talked. She told him about Velstone, about the Merchants' Council and the particular absurdity of that work, the way wealthy men in that city hired orcs for the dangerous or difficult jobs and then looked through them at dinners, and the way she had learned to be invisible in exactly the way that made her most effective. That angers me, he said. The invisible part, does it? Yes, he said. You are extremely visible to me, for the record. She looked at him across the table with her cup halfway to her lips, and something in her expression went very still. Not cold, the opposite of cold, still the way a held breath is still. Whitaker, she said. Reuben, he said. Another long pause. Reuben, she said, and it sounded like a door she was testing to see if it opened. That's better, he said. She drank her ale. The fire in the common room grate crackled. Around them, other travelers talked and ate and went to bed, and the two of them stayed at their table in the lamplight for a good while longer than supper required. They rode back to Crosshaven the next morning. The complaint was filed and they both needed to be there, him to maintain the cabin and she to formally notify Crewe of the filing block. Crewe did not take it well. Reuben was not present for this particular meeting, but he could hear it from the yard outside the post office, which was a solid log building with walls an inch thick, and Crewe's voice was penetrating several of those walls. Snaga's voice was not raising at all, which, he was learning, was not a good sign for the person she was talking to. Quiet Snaga was more dangerous than loud Snaga, and Crewe apparently did not understand this. 3 of Crewe's men came to the cabin that evening. Not Austin this time, different men, rougher, the kind hired for a purpose that didn't require documentation. Reuben was inside when they came and heard them on the porch. He came to the door with his hand axe in his hand, not raised, just held, and looked at them. Crewe wants to buy you out, one of them said. Fair price for a quick exit. Tell Crewe I'm not interested, Reuben said. He wants an answer tonight. He has one, Reuben said. They looked at him and at the axe and at each other, and they went away, and Reuben stood on his porch and was aware that the situation was getting toward the point where a legal complaint wouldn't be enough. Snaga arrived 20 minutes later at a pace that said she had heard about the visit. She came through the gate and up the steps and looked at him. Are you all right? She said. Fine, he said. They were making an offer. Crewe is moving faster than the charter review, she said. He has contacts in Durham. He filed a counter-complaint this morning, challenging my authority to represent you in the filing process. She stopped on the step below his, which put her eyes level with his. He's not trying to outlast the legal process, Reuben. He's trying to invalidate it, which means he has something I don't yet know about. What can he invalidate? My charter credentials, she said. I filed that complaint as a licensed charter enforcer. If he can argue that I was already in conflict of interest, that I had material interest in your case, the filing could be challenged. Material interest, he said. What does that mean in this context? She held his gaze steadily. It means if I am personally connected to you in any way that could be construed as partial, my professional authority in this matter becomes questionable. Are you personally connected to me? He asked, and the question sat between them with a weight that had nothing to do with charter law. In the legal sense, she said carefully, not yet. And in the other sense, the amber eyes didn't flicker. That is more complicated. He looked at her for a long moment. The evening was going dark and the first stars were coming out, and she was standing one step below him with her braid over one shoulder and her leather jacket catching the lamplight from inside the cabin door. And he thought about sitting on his porch for 2 days being waited out by a woman who had turned out to be the most interesting person he had spoken to in years. And he thought, with some surprise, that he hadn't felt this way about anything since the mountains when they were new. Stay, he said. I am staying, she said. No, he said. I mean stay, not just for the filing, not for the case, stay. The word hung in the cool air. She looked at him, and for the first time since he had met her she looked slightly uncertain, which on Snaga Ironhide looked like a very slight softening around the eyes and a very slight hesitation in her posture. But he was learning to read her in fine detail, and it was unmistakable. You don't know what you're asking, she said. I know exactly what I'm asking, he said. I've been alone on this mountain for 6 years, and I've had more conversation and better company in the last 3 days than I've had in all of them combined, and I don't think that's coincidence. I am an orc enforcer, she said. I am contracted to evict you. Those things are both true right now. The first is true, he said. The second is looking increasingly complicated. A very small sound escaped her, not quite a laugh but related to it. Reuben Whitaker, she said. Snaga Ironhide, he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, which was unexpected enough that he went very still, and she looked at him for a long searching moment, and then she kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss or a testing one. It was direct and decided and warm, and it tasted of the cold air and the dark ale from the previous night's supper, and something else that was simply her. And he put his hand over hers where it rested on his jaw and kissed her back. And the mountains were very dark and very quiet behind her, and the stars were out fully now, and the whole world had the enormous quality of a place that didn't know something important had just happened inside it. She pulled back and looked at him. Both of them were breathing a little more carefully than before. Complicated, she said, but she was looking at his mouth. Agreed, he said. She stayed. They spent the next 4 days in a kind of productive siege. Snaga set about systematically dismantling Crewe's counter-complaint by pulling every charter document she could access, writing 3 formal responses, and dispatching them to Durham by hired writer. She worked at his table with her documentation spread around her, precise and focused, and Reuben worked alongside her preparing his own records. 6 years of lease payments, boundary maintenance logs, guild receipts, the original lease agreement, a handwritten survey that he had done himself the previous spring that contradicted Crewe's surveyor's numbers point by point. It was, in the strangest way, one of the best weeks of his life. Not because the legal fight was enjoyable, though there was a satisfaction in building a well-documented case that he hadn't expected. It was because Snaga was there at his table, drinking his tea, telling him when his records were organized wrong, challenging him on points he had glossed over, occasionally pushing back from the table to pace when she was thinking through a problem, and the whole shape of the cabin was different with her in it, as if it had been waiting for more than one person to require its four walls. They bickered constantly. About strategy, about which documents were most important, about whether it was worth writing back to Durin before the formal review date. She was stubborn in a particular orc fashion that meant once she had decided a thing was right she would hold to it through considerable resistance. And he was stubborn in the particular way of men who had spent 6 years relying only on their own judgment. And when their arguments met, they went hard and hot, and neither gave ground without making the other earn it. After one particularly heated exchange about whether to send a writer to the guild office in Westmark, she slapped his draft letter on the table and said, "Your guild contact is 3 weeks out. Durin is 2 days. You are prioritizing sentiment over strategy," and he said, "I'm prioritizing the strongest possible argument over the fastest one. There is a difference." And she said, "The fast one works if we do not run out of time and the 14 days are not infinite." And he said, "The strong one works even if we do run out of time because it establishes the record." And they both stopped talking and looked at each other. "You are infuriating," she said. "You're magnificent," he said, which he hadn't planned to say, and she stared at him. Then she crossed the 2 steps between them and kissed him again, harder this time, with her hands on either side of his face and her whole considerable presence radiating something that was half frustration and half something entirely different. He kissed her back with equivalent thoroughness, and when they eventually stopped she had a very slight breathlessness that matched his own. "Send the writer to Westmark," she said. "We also send one to Durin," he said. "Fine," she said. "Fine," he said. They sent both writers. On the 6th day, things broke open. Reuben came back from checking his nearest trap line in the mid-morning to find the post in an uproar. He could see it before he got there. A crowd in the main yard raised voices, the particular quality of noise that meant something had gone wrong. He pushed his horse to a canter. Austin and 4 men had gone to the cabin in his absence. Snaga was in the yard of the post because she had ridden in for documents, and she had heard the same thing Reuben had, that Crewe had escalated, this time with a charter marshal he had apparently summoned from somewhere north. The marshal was in the post office. He was a heavy-set man with a warrant in his hand and a look of official discomfort, the look of a man who has been told he was coming to execute a clean paperwork matter and has arrived to find something considerably messier. He looked at Snaga, and then at Reuben, and then at the crowd that had gathered, which included the post smith and the 2 women who ran the dry goods, and a handful of trappers who had been around long enough to know Reuben's name and Crewe's reputation. "This is Alderman Crewe's post yard," the marshal said, with the conviction of a man who has been briefed, "and Alderman Crewe has the authority under the settlement charter too." "The settlement charter," Snaga said, from where she was standing in the middle of the yard with her staff in hand and her leather jacket open at the front, and the long morning light catching every line of her face, "includes a mandatory review period for contested lease actions. That review period was properly filed and time-stamped in Durin 4 days ago. Any enforcement action taken within that period is a charter violation, not a charter execution. I am a certified charter enforcer, and I am informing you formally and for the record that you are about to commit an illegal act." Dead silence in the yard. The marshal looked at his warrant. He looked at Snaga. He looked at Crewe, who had emerged from the post office doorway and was watching from 10 feet away with the expression of a man whose plan is not going the way he had drawn it. "She's an orc," Crewe said, with the specific force of a man throwing a stone. "Her filing is contestable. The marshal has jurisdiction." Several things happened in the yard at that moment. The post smith made a sound of disgust. One of the trappers, a weathered woman named Elda who had been working the western line for 20 years, stepped forward into the yard and said, "I saw Whitaker's lease filing when he renewed last year. It was clean. We all know it was clean." Another trapper nodded. The dry goods women exchanged a look. "This is not a community meeting," Crewe said tightly. "No," said Snaga very quietly. "It is a public yard, and these are free citizens of the Crosshaven district, And if the marshal chooses to execute a legally questionable warrant in front of witnesses who will all be available to testify to the Charter Review Board, that is his decision to make. The marshal had gone the color of old putty. He rolled up the warrant. "Alderman," he said to Crewe, in the tone of a man who has just decided he is not being paid enough, "I'm going to need to see the original filing documents before I can proceed. This situation requires review." Crewe's face did something ugly. Reuben, who had been standing at the edge of the yard, walked forward and stood next to Snaga, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and looked at Crewe directly. "While you review," he said, "I'll be at my cabin doing my work on my land." He turned and walked to his horse. Snaga fell into step beside him, and the crowd in the yard opened and let them both pass, and no one stopped them. They rode back up the road to the cabin in silence. Once they were through the gate and in the yard, Snaga dismounted in a single clean movement and stood with her reins in hand, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "That could have gone badly," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it did not. Because of you. Because of the law," she said. But she looked at him with her amber eyes and the morning sun on her face, and it was not the look of someone talking about law. He crossed the distance between them and put his hands on either side of her face, the way she had done to him in the dark on the porch steps, and she let him, standing very still with her reins still in hand, and he kissed her in the full morning light in the open yard, not carefully, not tentatively, just directly and completely, the way you kissed someone you had already decided about. She kissed him back, and the horses stood patient behind them, and the mountains were white and enormous in the north, and it was a very good morning. That night, sitting by the stove after supper, Snaga told him about the war. Not in full. There were things she wrapped her words around rather than going directly at, and he did not push. But she told him about being 12 years old when the Sarath agreements were signed, and feeling the way the clan swallowed that like something bitter, and about the 3 years afterward when some of the older warriors kept fighting because stopping felt like dying, and about the way she had been caught between what her clan was and what the world outside the clan required, and how the enforcer work was a form of navigation, a way of being in the human-run world without disappearing into it. "You're too good at it," he said. "The navigation, you make yourself look like you need nothing." "It is useful," she said. "It's a kind of loneliness," he said. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the fire. "Yes," she said, "that too." He reached over and took her hand, which was large and warm and strong, the hand of someone who had worked hard all their life, and he held it and she let him, and they sat like that while the fire burned down, not talking, and it was the most comfortable silence he had thought possible. 3 days later the situation exploded. It came from the north, not from Crewe. A rider came hard down the wagon road from the Sarath range 2 hours after dawn. A frontier outrider in patched leather who pushed his horse straight to the post and started shouting before he was fully dismounted. Reuben heard it from the cabin. He was on the roof patching a weak spot in the shingles, and he saw Snaga come to the porch door below him and look north with a sudden, complete stillness. He climbed down. By the time they got to the post, the rider had been given water and the crowd was thick. The news was bad and spreading fast. The Ironhide clan had broken the northern truce, not the whole clan. Reuben learned the details piece by piece over the next hour, pulling them out of the frightened crowd and putting them together. A breakaway band of younger Ironhide warriors, a splinter group from the language of the outrider, maybe 40 strong, had hit a string of homesteads along the upper Sarath road 2 days ago. Buildings burned. No confirmed deaths, people had gotten out, but 2 militia scouts were missing. The Regional Treaty Commission was invoking emergency provisions, which meant military enforcement was coming down from Westmark, which also meant that every orc in a 200-mile radius of the Sarath range was going to be having a very difficult time in the next few weeks. He found Snaga standing at the edge of the post yard, a little apart from the crowd, with her hands loose at her sides and her face absolutely controlled. He stood next to her. "Ironhide," someone in the crowd said, and it was not directed at her specifically, more a general processing of the news, but it landed in the air between them like a stone. She did not react. He watched her not react, and he understood what it was costing her. "Come on," he said quietly. "I should come on," he said again, and put his hand briefly on her arm, and she came. They walked back to the cabin. The road felt longer than usual. Inside, she sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and said nothing for a long time, and he made tea and put it in front of her and sat down across from her and waited. "It is not the clan," she said finally. "The full Ironhide Council signed the Sarath agreements. Whatever this band is, it is not the voice of the clan, but that will not matter to most people in this district." "No," he said. "It won't. The Treaty Commission will want to make an example. The military presence from Westmark will give men like Crewe exactly the climate they need to push through anything they want, including evictions of anyone they find inconvenient." She looked at her tea. "It will also give them license to challenge my authority as a charter enforcer on grounds of clan affiliation, regardless of the fact that I have been in this district for 3 months and have had no contact with the Sarath Range in 3 years. They'll try to associate you with the raid." "Yes. Then we need to move faster on the charter complaint," he said. "The 14 days are almost up anyway. We need the review to happen before Westmark forces arrive and the local political atmosphere becomes impossible." She looked at him. "The review is in Durham. The formal session is in 4 days. If we go and present the case in person, it is stronger, but it also means leaving the cabin unattended, and Crewe will use that window. Then we go and come back fast. The road to Durham takes a full day each way, 3 days round trip minimum. Can we do it in 2, he said. On horseback pushing hard, she said, possibly. Then we push hard, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. You understand that even if the review goes in your favor, the current climate means Crewe may find other grounds, and my involvement in your case, my clan name, will be used against both of us. I know, he said. It could get considerably worse before it gets better. I know that too, he said. Snaga, look at me. She looked at him. I'm not leaving, he said, and I'm not letting you face this alone. Those are both decided things. Her throat moved. The amber eyes were bright and steady. When did you decide that? She said. I think when you sat on my porch, he said. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Reuben, she said, and that was all, but the way she said his name was a complete sentence. They left for Durham before first light. The road was cold and fast in the dark, and they rode with lamps and pushed the horses to a mile-leading pace. The high plains at night were immense and silent, and the stars over the Sarath peaks were extraordinary, thick and cold and white, and they rode close together on the narrow road and talked when they could. She told him about orc courtship. He had asked carefully, the way he asked things that might have edges, and she had considered, and then she told him. In the Ironhide tradition, she said, you did not declare yourself to someone in words first. You declared yourself in action. You did the thing that showed what you meant, and then the words came after, when both people already knew what they were confirming. It was called the first stake, like marking territory, but inward, a way of saying this is where I am standing and here is the ground I claim. The kiss, he said. On the porch, was that? Yes, she said. Then I should have said something sooner. You said what needed to be said, she told him. They rode in silence for a moment. The horse's breath was visible in the lamp light, small clouds of warmth. In human tradition, he said, you say the words first and hope the action follows. Does that work? She asked. He thought about it honestly. Sometimes, he said, less often than people pretend. In orc tradition, she said, the words are the confirmation, not the declaration. So the declaration has already been made. When? He said. When I stayed, she said. When you sat on my porch, you mean? Yes, she said, and he could hear the warmth in it, deep and certain. When I sat on your porch and did not move. He reached across the gap between their horses and found her hand in the dark and held it, and she let him keep it for the next mile until the road narrowed too much for riding side by side, and even then he thought the contact lingered. They reached Durham at mid-morning with hard-ridden horses, and went straight to the charter office. The clerk from the first visit recognized Snaga's face and was already backing toward the senior clerk's office before she finished presenting the formal review request, which probably said something about the impression she had made. The senior clerk was a small, bespectacled woman named Harrow who turned out to be both competent and unintimidated, which put her in rare company. She read through Reuben's documentation with the focused attention of someone who did this for genuine reasons, and she read through Snaga's 3 formal responses to Crewe's counter-complaint, and she looked at both of them over her spectacles and said, "The original enforcement order is clearly defective. The subsidiary clause cited as the compact breach has not been active in this district since the charter revision of 41 years ago. Whoever prepared this order either made a significant error or acted with deliberate deception." "The latter," Snaga said. "I rather assumed," Clerk Harrow said dryly. "The counter-complaint challenging your professional authority is also defective, though more cleverly. However," she paused, "the current political atmosphere following the Sareth incident creates an irregular situation. The Commission will be anxious to show that charter process is still functioning normally, which actually works in your favor if the review is completed today and entered into the formal record before any emergency provisions are invoked." "Can it be completed today?" Reuben said. "It can be if both of you stay for the afternoon session and I bring it forward," she said. "Which I am going to do, because I have had 3 enforcement orders from this district in the past year with identical procedural irregularities, and I have been waiting for someone to give me the documented grounds to investigate Alderman Crewe." Reuben looked at Snaga. Snaga looked at Clerk Harrow with an expression of profound, carefully controlled satisfaction. "We are available for the afternoon session," Snaga said. The review took 4 hours and was, for Reuben, alternately tedious and thrilling in the way that legal proceedings were when you were the subject of them. He gave his account clearly and completely, presented his documents in the order Snaga had organized them, and answered the panel's questions with the directness he had managed to maintain throughout this entire affair. Snaga was extraordinary. She presented her formal response to the counter-complaint with a precision and a structural elegance that made the panel lean in, and when the panel's second member tried to raise the question of her clan name carefully, with the diplomatic discomfort of a man who knows he is wading into something, she met it head-on. "I am Snaga Ironhide of the Ironhide clan," she said, "and I have not been to the Sareth Range in 3 years and have no involvement in the actions of the splinter group being reported. My clan affiliation is on public record, as it has been since I received my charter credentials. It was not considered a conflict of interest when Alderman Crewe engaged me as enforcer. It does not become one now because it is politically useful to someone to suggest otherwise." The panel member looked at his notes. "On the contrary," she continued, "the attempt to retroactively weaponize my clan name to undermine a legitimate filing is precisely the kind of procedural abuse that charter review exists to prevent. If the review board accepts that argument, it creates a precedent by which any enforcer of Orc heritage can be retroactively discredited whenever political circumstances make it convenient. I trust the board will not wish to establish that precedent." Silence in the review room. Clerk Harrow made a small, approving note on her paper. The review was decided in Reuben's favor at the end of the 4th hour. The enforcement order was voided. Crewe's counter-complaint was dismissed. A formal investigation into the alderman's use of charter enforcement was initiated by Clerk Harrow, which was a consequence Reuben suspected Crewe had not anticipated and would find considerably more uncomfortable than losing the original case. They came out of the charter office into the late afternoon light of Durhan's Main Street, and Reuben stood on the step and breathed the cool air and felt the very specific relief of a man who has fought on the right ground and won. Snaga stood beside him. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He turned and looked at her. She was looking out at the street with the light on her face, and she looked tired, properly tired, the fatigue of someone who has spent days maintaining perfect composure under considerable pressure, and she looked satisfied, and she looked more beautiful than anyone he had seen in years, and he was entirely certain about what he was going to say. "Come back with me," he said. "I am coming back with you," she said. "The horses need tending, and it is a long ride." "That's not what I mean," he said. She looked at him. "I mean come back with me and stay," he said. "Not for the case, not professionally. Come back because you choose to." Come back as he stopped, conscious of getting the language right. "As the person who is there when I come home." She was very still. "My engagement with Crewe is voided along with the enforcement order," she said, working through it aloud as if she needed the logic in order to trust the emotion. "I have no professional obligation to remain in Crosshaven." "None," he agreed. "I would be staying on my own account." "Yes." "Which is considerably more complicated than a work engagement." "Considerably," he said. "I know." She looked at him with those amber eyes, steady and deep and warm with something that she had been not quite saying for days. "In Orc tradition," she said carefully, "the second stake is the confirmation. After the first declaration has been made and answered. You have answered it." She paused. "The second stake is when one person says, 'I am choosing you specifically above the other paths.'" "I know there are other paths," he said. "I am choosing you specifically." Something shifted in her face. The composure remained. It was part of her. It had been earned through years of difficult navigation, but something behind it opened, warm and full. "Reuben Whitaker," she said, "you are very troublesome." "I know," he said. "You argue about everything." "So do you." "You made me stay on a porch for 2 days and drink your cold tea." "You drank it," he said. "I did," she agreed. "I did drink it." And then, very softly, almost to herself, "I drank it and I did not leave." He put his hands on her face, his thumbs against her jaw, careful of the tusks, and looked at her from very close, and she looked back at him, and the street around them was full of Duran's evening bustle, carts and voices, and the clank of the chandler's sign in the wind, and none of it was louder than the two of them in the center of it. "Stay," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes." He kissed her in the middle of the street in the full light of late afternoon, and she kissed him back with the directness that was entirely her, decided, complete, the action saying everything the words had already confirmed. And the people of Duran's Main Street navigated around them with varying degrees of approval and disapproval and the occasional double take, and neither of them noticed at all. They rode back north the next morning. The ride home was entirely different from the ride out, which had been a hard, functional push against a deadline. The road home was slower not because they were tired, though they were, but because neither of them was in a hurry, which was its own kind of statement. Snaga told him about the clan's stone-carving tradition in more detail, about how boundary markers doubled as history, and he told her about the trapline in autumn when the color was in the aspens and the whole upper ridge turned gold, and they made plans in the loose, easy way of people who have decided they are going to have time. Midway through the second morning, with the Sarath Peaks visible to the north and the trading post beginning to appear as a smudge of rooftops against the grass, the situation made one more attempt to go badly. The road was empty ahead of them, and then it was not. 3 riders came around the long bend in the road at a canter, and Reuben recognized Austin at the front of them, and one of the other 2 was the new man Crewe had brought in since the Sarath news, a heavy individual who wore blades at both hips and the look of someone who treated legal nuance as optional. They pulled across the road. "Whitaker," Austin said, "we've been waiting." "The review came back," Reuben said. "The order is voided. Crewe's complaint is dismissed. You have no grounds and no authority." "Crewe says different," said Austin. "Crewe can take it up with the charter board, which is currently investigating him," Snaga said, with a precise flatness that would have made smarter men reassess. But Austin's man at the back moved his horse sideways to block the road behind them, and the second man came forward with a hand going to his belt, and Reuben understood in one clear instant that this had stopped being about legality. Crewe had decided that losing the legal argument meant switching to a different kind of argument. They were on the wagon road with open plain on either side and the road itself narrow between a cutbank on the left and a steep slope dropping to a shallow river gully on the right. The gully was maybe 20 feet below and the bank was rocky but not sheer. He had ridden this road 100 times. He knew the line of it, knew where the gully bottom flattened and gave good footing. He looked at Snaga. She looked at him. She saw it in his face. And he saw her see it and saw her make the same calculation in about 1 second. "The gully," he said. "Yes," she said. Austin's hand man came forward at exactly that moment, close enough to reach, and Snaga did not wait. She drove her horse hard left, putting it between the man and Reuben, and her staff came up and caught the man's reaching arm with a crack that made him shout, and Reuben kicked his roan hard toward the road's right edge and went over. It was not elegant. It was a controlled fall, his horse dropping the bank at a steep scramble, hooves throwing stones, Reuben pressing low and forward as the ground rushed up. Behind him he heard Austin shouting, and then a second impact and a heavy crashing that meant Snaga had come over the edge too, either by choice or persuasion. The gully bottom was 30 feet of rocky gravel and shallow water, and his roan hit it at speed and stumbled and then caught, and Reuben was up in the saddle looking back up the bank. Snaga came down the bank at a dead run, her gray horse's haunches nearly touching the slope, and she hit the gully bottom beside him in a spray of gravel and water, upright and controlled, and her amber eyes were absolutely alive, lit from inside with the particular energy of someone who finds danger genuinely clarifying. "Go," she said. They went. The gully ran parallel to the road for a quarter-mile before turning west toward the river, and they rode it at a full gallop, the horses kicking through the shallow water, the banks a blur on either side. Above them on the road, Reuben could hear shouting, and the sound of hooves following at the lip of the bank but not coming down. Either they were more cautious about the drop or their horses were. And then the gully curved west and the sound faded, and there was just the wind and their horses breathing and the enormous quiet of the plains. They came up out of the gully through a low spot in the bank half a mile past the road and turned north across the open grass at a canter, putting ground between them and the road. And when they were far enough that the post buildings were visible directly ahead and the road was a pale line to their left with no pursuit on it, they slowed. Reuben looked at Snaga. She was breathing hard and her braid had come half undone and there was river water up to her knee from the gully crossing, and she was grinning, which was the first time he had seen her grin fully, and it was extraordinary wide and unguarded, full of teeth and both tusks and a radiant, entirely impractical delight. "I have never jumped a horse off a wagon road embankment before," she said. "Agreed it's not a recommended method," he said. "It was effective," she said. "It was," he said. She looked at him with that open grin and he thought he would do it again, honestly, if the view from the bottom was going to be her coming down that bank like something elemental, alive in every line of her. "You are not going to tell me that was reckless," she said. "Would it help if I did?" "No," she said. "Then I'm not going to," he said. She laughed. Properly, fully, the sound of it going out into the open grass and the high blue sky, and he thought it was the best sound he had heard in this valley in the whole 6 years he had been here. They came into the post yard from the north, circling the road, and the sight of them muddy, water-spattered, approaching from the wrong direction, brought the post yard to a brief stop. Elda the trapper saw them first, and something in her expression said she had already heard about Austin's men going out to wait on the road, and her expression went from worry to relief to something privately satisfied. Crewe was nowhere to be seen. They found out the following day that Clerk Harrow's formal inquiry had moved fast, and the commission representative from Westmark had arrived not to enforce emergency provisions, but to execute a provisional suspension of Crewe's alderman authority pending the charter investigation. Crewe had, with the instinct of someone who recognizes a collapsing position, taken the early morning stage east before anyone came to find him. Austin and his men had gone too, quietly, the way mercenary help always did when the money stopped being reliable. The Crosshaven post was, for the moment, running on the collective management of the post smith, the dry goods women, and the remaining staff, which turned out to function considerably better than anyone had expected. Reuben's cabin was intact. His trapline was intact. His lease, as re-entered in the charter record, was valid for a further 3 years with option to renew. His guild documentation was clean. He sat on his porch the evening after they returned, and the light was the same long gold as it had been the day he had first watched Snaga come up the road, and the mountains were the same honey and dark spruce and enormous snow, and the whole valley was very good. The door behind him opened and Snaga came out with 2 cups of tea and sat down on the porch steps, exactly where she had sat the first day, and handed his cup over her shoulder. He took it, sat, looked at the mountains. "The Westmark representative wants a statement from you about Crewe," she said. "They'll need it for the formal record." "I'll give it," he said. "I will need to give one as well," she said, "regarding the enforcement order and the counter-complaint." "I know. It will complicate my charter standing temporarily," she said, "because I was the original enforcement agent. Even though the order was fraudulent, there will be a review of my actions." "You know what you did," he said. "Yes," she said, "but institutional process does not always move as fast as individual certainty." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at the back of her braid, the straight line of her shoulders, the way she held her cup, and he thought about how thoroughly he had come to know that silhouette in the past 10 days, how completely she had become part of the landscape of the place he called home. "While you're waiting on institutional process," he said, "you're still here." "Yes," she said, "and after institutional process finishes." She turned and looked at him over her shoulder, and the amber eyes were warm and direct and entirely certain. "I told you," she said. "I sat on this porch and I did not move." "You did move," he said. "Eventually." "Yes," she said, and there was something in it that was both an acknowledgement and a promise. "When I was ready and not before." He leaned forward and pressed a kiss to the top of her head, into the thick dark of her hair, and she reached back and found his knee and held it, and they sat on the porch in the long evening light with their tea going warm between their hands. Later, after the light was gone and the stars were out, and the cabin windows were the only warm thing visible on the whole dark mountain slope, they were inside at the table with the fire going, and the meal finished, and the evening spreading out comfortably around them. Snaga was working on a letter to the Ironhide clan council. She had told him a formal account of the Sarath splinter group incident from someone with standing who had not been present, because the clan needed to know what was being said in the district settlements, and to know that the official record distinguished between the council's position and the breakaway group. It was careful, important work, and she was giving it the full gravity it deserved. Reuben was cleaning his roan's tack at the other end of the table, which was the kind of peaceable domestic parallel occupation that he would have found inconceivable 6 months ago in the context of not being alone. He looked at her across the table. The lamp caught her face in warm light, the strong lines of her jaw, the slight curve of her tusks, the concentrated furrow between her brows that appeared when she was working through a complex piece of language. The leather bodice was still laced precisely, and her riding jacket was over the chair back, and her feet were up on the hearth stone, and she looked like someone who had always been exactly here. "Snaga," he said. She looked up. "I need you to know something," he said. She waited. "I have been alone on this mountain for a long time," he said. "Not unhappily, I chose it. But there is a kind of quiet that is restful and a kind of quiet that is just the absence of something you haven't found yet. And I didn't know the difference until you sat on my porch steps and refused to leave." He paused. "You are the best thing that has happened to me in a very long time, maybe ever. And I want you to know that I know that, and I am not taking it for granted, and I will not take you for granted." She held his gaze for a long moment. "I have been navigating for a long time," she said carefully. Between what I am and what the world outside my clan requires, making myself manageable, useful and efficient and not too much, she paused. You have not once asked me to be less. Not once. Why would I? He said. Most people do, she said simply. Then most people are wrong, he said. She got up from her chair and came around the table and stood in front of him, and he turned in his chair to face her, and she put her hands on his face the way she did, the specific tender certainty of it, both hands cupping his jaw, and looked at him for a long moment. In the Ironhide tradition, she said, the second stake is the confirmation, but the third stake is the permanent one. She stroked her thumbs along his jaw. It is the one you do not walk back from. Tell me about it, he said. It is a mark, she said. Not visible to everyone, an orc thing. She pressed her thumb gently against the line of his jaw where it met his neck. Here, a mark in the orc script. It says this one is chosen. It says, I have claimed them and they have claimed me. Does the other person get to put one on you? He said. She blinked. Something surprised moved across her face as if this was not what she had expected. Traditionally, she said, it is done both ways, but it is not always humans often. Show me, he said. I want to if you want to. She looked at him for a long time, amber eyes very bright. Yes, she said. Yes, I want to. She went to her satchel and came back with a small, careful kit, a narrow stylus and a pot of dark pigment that smelled of pine resin and iron. And she explained as she worked that the mark was not permanent in the way of a scar, but lasted a season and could be renewed. And the renewal itself was part of the custom. She made the mark on his jaw with careful, steady hands, the stylus precise and the touch intimate in a way that was deeply different from anything else. A kind of attention that was entirely focused on him, entirely about him, and he held very still for her and watched her face while she worked. When she finished, she sat back and looked at what she had made, and the expression on her face was one he had not seen before, open and wondering and deeply, thoroughly pleased. Now me, he said. She showed him the character to trace. He took the stylus carefully and found the place on her jaw that corresponded to his and worked slowly, aware of how much the precision mattered, and she sat perfectly still for him with her eyes closed, and her hands folded in her lap and a small smile at the corner of her mouth. He finished. He set the stylus down and looked at his work on her gray-green skin, imperfect compared to her careful craft but legible and real. It says, chosen, she told him. Yes, he said. She opened her eyes. He kissed her and she wound her arms around him, and the fire burned steady in the grate, and the mountains were enormous and dark outside, and the cabin was warm and full, and all the quiet it had ever held was now a different kind of quiet, the kind that had room in it, the kind that was not absence but completion. In the weeks that followed, the Crosshaven district settled into its new configuration, with the practical adaptability of a community that had been waiting for the specific weight of Crewe to lift. The post-Smith took on an expanded administrative role, while the Charter Commission sent a new district officer. Elda and two other long-standing trappers formed a provisional compact oversight group that was, by most accounts, considerably more honest than anything that had preceded it. Snaga's charter standing was reviewed, as she had predicted, and confirmed. The formal statement entered into the record was actually used as part of the Commission's case against Crewe, whose exploitation of charter enforcement mechanisms turned out to be significantly more extensive than even she had known. The Sarath situation resolved with somewhat more complexity and somewhat less blood than the initial alarm had suggested. The splinter group was small and had overextended itself, and the Ironhide Clan Council, helped in part by Snaga's letter, which reached them through channels she didn't fully explain, issued a formal statement of dissociation that the Treaty Commission accepted. The military presence from Westmark came, and finding the immediate situation diffused, took a supervisory rather than punitive role, which was about the best outcome anyone had dared hope for. Reuben rode his trapline in the first hard frost of autumn, walking the ridges he knew with the particular satisfaction of a man who has kept the thing he fought for. And when he came home in the long cold evening, Snaga was there. sometimes at the table, sometimes on the porch in the fading light with a cup of something hot, always present with the warm, specific weight of a person who had made a decision about a place and intended to keep it. She had sent for her few personal belongings from the accommodation she had kept in Velstone. They arrived on a post wagon 2 weeks after the charter review, 2 chests, a roll of maps, a set of writing implements, and a long orc-made hunting bow that she told him she had been carrying since she was 16, and was the one item from her time in the Sarath Range she had never been willing to leave behind. He made room in the cabin for everything, which involved some reorganization and a new shelf he built on the eastern wall. And the morning she hung the bow on that shelf and stood back and looked at it, he watched something settle in her, a last small tension going out, and he understood what it meant. She was not visiting. She was home. One evening in the deep autumn, with the first snow on the upper peaks and the aspens gone to bare silver along the creek, they sat on the porch after supper in the cold, clean air with blankets around their shoulders, looking out at the mountains they both loved. "I want to take you up the East Ridge in spring," he said, "when the beaver dams come back in. There's a spot above the tree line where you can see 3 valleys at once." "I want to see it," she said. "And there's a surveyor's stone up there from before Crewe's survey, original boundary marker. We should probably make sure it's in the formal record." "I will look into it," she said. "Of course you will," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The mountains were bone-white and enormous in the dark, and the stars were out in their thousands, and the whole valley was very still, and the warm weight of her against his side was the most solid, real, certain thing he had felt in 6 years of seasons on this mountain, more real than the cabin, more certain than the trapline, more sure than anything he had built or earned or found on his own. "Reuben," she said. "Yes." "I am glad you did not leave," she said. "I told you," he said, "I wasn't going anywhere." She lifted her head and looked at him, and the moonlight was on her face, and the mark on her jaw was just visible in that light, and his was on his own face, he knew, and they had renewed them both the previous week as if it were the most natural thing in the world, because it was. He kissed her, slow and warm, and she kissed him back, and the night was cold and the blanket was warm, and the mountains stood around them the way mountains did, patient and immense, as if they had always known this was how it would go, a man who would not be moved from his own porch, and a woman who had sat down and decided not to move from his, and the whole long, stubborn, beautiful negotiation that had turned out to be the best thing either of them had ever managed to hold on to. She settled back against him, and he pulled the blanket tighter, and they stayed out there a long time in the dark, not needing to go in, not needing to say anything more, just present together in the high mountain air, where the season was turning and everything was cold and clear and exactly right.